Okay, hello YouTube. I am going to be doing something today. I'm going to be replacing the scope rings on my Ruger 1022. As you can see, I have mounted in my vise right here. Um, Previously, for a very long time, I had these Weaver um, see-through rings. They're actually really cheap. I remember when I bought them, I thought, well, I can use the sights at the same time as the rings. Um, but they're actually really kind of cheap. They're kind of flimsy. Um, they're fine for a 22 rifle. Um, the only major problem with these is, especially since I started to take my kids to the range and teach them how to shoot with my 1022, one of the major problems is that these rings are very, very, very high, like super extra high, because they have to have the space here so you can see through in order to use the iron sights. And because of the design of the stock here, it's got a conventionally designed, American style stock. It puts the scope very, very high above your eye line. So you don't get a very good cheek weld when you put your face on the stock, even for a full grown person. But when you're teaching a kid, a 6, 8, 10-year-old kid how to shoot on this rifle, because their faces are so much smaller, it creates a really major problem. In fact, they can't even, if they want to use the scope, they can't even put their cheek on the stock. They have to keep their cheek totally off the stock, which of course is teaching very, very poor marksmanship technique. So I decided finally to go ahead and replace those rings with something that's lower. But I also went ahead and picked up this Picatinny rail for the 1022. This was really pretty inexpensive. It's UTG brand. I've actually got a couple of different UTG rails and rings that I've used on different rifles, and yes, it's made in China. But to be honest with you, the price is pretty decent, and the quality is very good. I've never had any problems with these. They fit just like they're supposed to. The quality of the aluminum in the rail is very good. The dimensions are right on. I mean, they're dead nuts as far as the Picatinny spec goes. So I've never had any issues with these, and they're relatively inexpensive. And I figured for a 1022, it's not a big deal. This rifle, it now that 22 ammo is available, it gets a lot of use again. But it's not exactly like the 22 is going to beat the crap out of the scope mounting system, so it should be just fine. My only gripe, the only gripe that I have with the UTG is that the screws that it comes with are just regular. You can see that, just regular slotted screws, just a plain common head screw, rather than a hex or a Torx screw, which you'll see with a more expensive mount. Now, other UTG products that I've got, and I don't know if I have any just laying around here somewhere, but they've had hex head. For whatever reason, they decided to use slotted screws for the 1022. I would rather have hex head, but it'll work. So anyway, I'm going to mount this on to my 1022, and you can see there's some crap under here from the previous scope mount, and I tried to scrape this off, and what I discovered, much to my dismay, is that the aluminum receiver on the 1022 is definitely not hard anodized like you would see like on an AR-15. The AR-15's hard anodized finish is extremely durable. This is not so much. This is just a regular anodization. What I did was I tried to scrape some of this crap off of here, and I used a brush and a bronze brush, and I kind of scratched the crap out of the top of the receiver. It took right through the finish and into the aluminum below. A lot of people would freak out about that. Personally, I don't give a crap. I mean, this rifle has, you know, been through hell and back. It's actually got some rust spots on it. It's really, this is just a utilitarian rifle. It's really something that I just, you know, use for fun. I mean, it's got some blemishes on the stock here. This rifle was involved in a flood incident where it got flooded. So that's why there's some rust on the barrel. Still shoots great, works great, but it's not the prettiest thing in the world. I don't really care. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and mount this base on here. As you can see, the base lines up, those holes line up just about perfect. I mean, they are dead on. So I'm going to show how I kind of do this. So I'm going to go ahead and put the scope base Picatinny rail on there. I will go ahead and mount that on to the rifle, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how I will mount the scope. So, be back. Okay, I've mounted the scope on there. You can still see actually a little bit of Loctite that I've got with the excess that I had on there. But anyway, one thing I will say, of course, generally speaking, when you torque down scope mounts, usually they recommend between 20 and 30 inch-pounds for the bases, and usually for the rings it's between 15 and 20 inch-pounds of torque for the rings. I suppose a true professional gunsmith is going to use a torque screwdriver. I don't have one. I have been mounting scopes for decades and have always just used a screwdriver or an Allen key or Torx key, and I just have kind of got a feel for it. The biggest thing, you want to get them snug, but you do not need to gorilla torque them down. You certainly don't have to get anywhere near stripping them, and you don't want to get them so tight that you're going to bend anything. That's not necessary. That's why you use the Loctite. The Loctite will keep the fastener from backing out. You don't have to have a super duper amount of torque in order to make the mounting system stable. I've got this mounted on here. I'm going to show how I mount the scope. Actually, I need to put my rings on here. I've just got some, like I said, these are just some really old, I'm not even sure, they're kind of rusty and gross. They just kind of came out of a bin that I had, but you know, whatever, I don't care. Maybe someday I'll spray paint them, refinish them, whatever. But I'm going to mount those on here, and then I'll show how I level the scope. So, okay, I'm back. Now, one thing I've had for quite a long time is this little bubble level. This is really, really helpful for setting up a scope, particularly on a Picatinny rail type system, or Weaver rail. And the reason why is because this has got the 8 flat sides on it. It's got the bubble level in the middle, and it's relatively small, and you can get into these areas, and you can use it to level everything as you're setting up the scope to help you get the crosshairs level without just kind of eyeballing it. Level crosshairs, of course, are extremely important on any rifle that's going to be shot at longer ranges. The 22, maybe not such a big deal, but I like to get it, you know, pretty close to dead nuts. And so what I've done is I put this bubble level in here, and actually, interestingly enough, what this is actually a bubble level that is used for leveling and setting up the fly bar and rotor head of a radio-controlled helicopter. I've actually had this for many, many years, back in the days when I used to be into model helicopters. And if you want to talk about a very expensive hobby, that's it right there. But I've just hung on to this, and I use it now for setting up optics. So anyway, as you see, I've got my rifle in my vise, and I've adjusted so that the rifle forward and aft is dead level. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to set it across the Picatinny rail. And as you can see, the bubble's not level, so I'm going to tweak that just a little bit. I'll try to do this here with one hand. It's going to be hard. The point is, I'm going to try to get the bubble as close to dead center as I can, and I'm going to torque the vise down. See, I've already slid the rings on here. Like I said, they're kind of gnarly, but I've kind of cleaned them up a little bit with some rem oil, and they actually don't look too bad. But I've got them loose so they can slide. I'm going to take my scope. I'm going to set my scope on here. And this, as you can see, this is just a cheap Simmons 8.3x9 magnification scope. It's 3x9 by probably 32 or something. It's very, very cheap. Probably only have 75 to 100 bucks in this scope. It's really nothing fancy. But for a 22, I've had this on my 22 for many years. It works. It holds at 0. And the recoil of the 22 doesn't beat up the Simmons scope too bad. Would I put this on the 300 Win mag? Oh no, not even a 30-06 or a 270. I think it would come apart. But for the 22, it works just great. Anyway, I've got this, so I've got it so I can adjust this a little bit, so I can see where I'm going to set my rings. Probably about right there. And so I'll go ahead and put the crossbars in there and screw those down with a little bit of Loctite. I'll be back in just a second. Okay, one thing I also would like to mention too, my dog's fight in the background. When you're setting up a Picatinny rail or a Weaver rail, a good idea when you're mounting and tightening down the screws for the rings themselves, what you want to do is put the bolt through, and then before you tighten it down, slide the ring all the way to the front as far as it'll go with the bolt in there before you tighten it down. That way the bolt is pressed against the front of the Picatinny rail groove, okay? And the reason why you want to do that, in the 22 it's not really all that important, but for harder recoiling rifle, a centerfire rifle or whatnot, what happens is if you don't push that ring snug so that it's firmly against the front of the rail, when that gun recoils, there's a chance, even despite the fact that those rings are appropriately tight, that the ring could actually shift and slide a little bit forward, especially if they're both like that. So what I've always done is I've gotten in the habit of always pushing the rings forward against the front of the slot, so that they are not going to go anywhere when the rifle recoils. So I've gone ahead and tightened these down. I put a little bit of blue Loctite on there. Now I've got my scope sitting on here. I've already kind of eyeballed it to kind of get an idea of where the eye relief is going to be. But then, since I've already leveled the rifle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bubble level and I'm going to set it on top here. As you can see, you set it right on the top turret, and as you can see, the scope is right where it's right level fore and aft, right where it needs to be. So the rings and the scope and the Picatinny rail, because the Picatinny rail was already leveled fore and aft, everything's all in alignment, so that's good. That means that the scope is sitting down in those rings like it should be. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that 90 degrees sideways, and I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to adjust. And what I found is that the turrets are usually pretty much dead on, within a degree. Now I suppose if you are going for super precision, I don't know if you can really see that very well, but I'm looking at it with my eyes, and right there, that is just about perfect. Okay? So I've leveled the scope just tentatively at this point, and I'm going to put the tops of the rings on here, and I'm going to start running the screws in. Now this is the tricky part, because once you start getting the screws installed, I'm going to go ahead and put some blue Loctite. Gosh darn it. Sometimes the Loctite just kind of spurts out of there, and I'm doing this with one hand, so it's not particularly coordinated either, which sucks. You really don't need very much of this stuff, but put a little tiny dab of blue Loctite on each of these. Okay, so what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've screwed down the 4 screws here until they are just barely started to tighten up. Okay, and I've still got my bubble level, and it's dead on. Now here's the tricky part. When you start tightening these down, what's going to happen is that friction is going to start moving the scope. And it might cause the scope to turn back and one way or the other. So what you have to do is you have to very, very tentatively tighten these down, very slowly torque them down. Just a tiny little bit at a time, and you pay attention to that bubble level. And make sure it doesn't move. Give it a little more torque, and you're going to go across in a cross pattern. Here, torque this one a little bit more. Hasn't moved. We'll go across. Torque the opposing side just a little bit. Still hasn't moved. Go crossways here. Torque this one down a little bit more, and that one's getting pretty close to where it needs to be. Torque this one, that one's getting pretty close. Torque this one, that one's right where it needs to be. That one's right there. I'm going to go through and just kind of give these one last little torquing. Like I said, 15 to 20 inch-pounds, which is really not that much. I'm using a screwdriver here, and these are torque screws on these rings. You don't have to muscle them in there. They really, in fact, if you get too crazy torquing down your rings, you can actually crush the scope tube, and I've done that before on, fortunately, a less expensive scope that it didn't really matter. But if you know you've got your $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, Zeiss or Vortex or Leopold or whatever it is in here, and you're doing this, you sure as hell don't want to tighten it down so much that you're going to crush the tube. So you hear my boys in the other room. Their playroom is right next to my workshop here across the wall. So, but anyway, that's pretty much it. So I'm going to take this out of the vise, and I'm going to check and make sure that the crosshairs still look nice and level. But as you can see, I've got one scope mounted to the 1022. It's much, much lower than it was before. I've really become quite fond of the Picatinny rail system. You know, they call it, I think this is really funny actually, it's called a tactical low profile rail mount for the 1022 rifle, which I think is funny because I can't think of a rifle that's any less tactical than a 1022. And I don't care what accessories you put on it. I don't care if you put, you know, fancy AR-15 style stock and all that other nonsense, and a muzzle brake or a flash hider. It's still just a 22, you know. But to each their own. You know, the tactical crowd. I just want a functional scope mount, so that's what I've got here. Functional scope and scope mount that's actually going to lower the scope down to where it's actually at a functional height. It's not too far, as you can see, not too far over the top of the sight there. Still got good access to the bolt panel here. The bolt. It should be much more functional. So that's really it. Thanks for watching.